As Megan said, I've been gone for 8 years now from Bethany, and so I'm not going to bore you with a big update on my life. As Megan said, many of you I don't know. I'm happy to have some of those conversations afterwards and actually kind of look forward to those. But by way of introduction, I will say that 8 years ago, my wife and I left Bethany. She took a job at a hospital up in Skagit Valley, so we're up Mount Vernon. But also, I've always had this dream of kind of living this more rural life. And so we moved up there. It has been a wonderful season. I stepped into a new role as a stay-at-home dad when we moved up there. My kids effectively at that time were ages 1 and -1. And so that has been my life for the last 8 years, is kind of the day-to-day stuff of raising kids. I have pastored a little church through kind of its season of dissolution in that time. I'm now currently serving. I was asked to pastor a group of friends who affectionately we call ourselves Barn Church. And as I've said that several times, people have been like, oh, I like that. Like, that's catchy. You're in a rural community, Barn Church. I go, oh, no, we are a church that meets in a barn. Like, that's not really a name as much as it is an adjective. The kids literally do Sunday school in an old milking parlor. And it has been an incredible gift to me to be in life with these folks, a humble group of people who are asking questions about faith and where to find Christ in a world that seems like it's always changing. And it's just been really life-giving to me. But as I said, as my kids are getting older now, I find myself kind of asking this question, what's next? That the minute-by-minute parenting of little kids, now my kids are going to school all day. As my hours open up, my life is kind of opening up, and I find myself asking this question, what's next? And I share that by way of introduction, but I also share it because it's at the heart of this story of Elijah as we see him in this season of transition, as he's now stepping into this space of what's next, as he now takes this mantle of prophetic leadership from Elijah. And this question of what's next is one I feel like I've been asking my entire adult and even pre-adult life. In fact, when I was 25 years old, my father, who's no longer living, but was exactly 40 years older than me, when I was 25, I found myself at a bit of a junction in life where I had to make some decisions. I'd been dating a gal for several years, and we needed to figure out if we should get married or not. We did not. I was trying to figure out whether to change jobs, to go to graduate school, to potentially change professions altogether. And having always appreciated my dad's wisdom, I asked my dad if we could get together for lunch. And so I called him, and he said, I'm so glad you called. There's some stuff that I've been wanting to talk to you about as well. And so as we got together, before I can kind of get to the meat of what I want to ask my dad says, I am so glad that you took the time to set this up. I've been thinking about this constantly. I'm 65 years old, and I'm asking, what am I gonna do with the rest of my life? And at one level, it takes the wind out of your sails, right? Like, I've come to you for wisdom. I see myself at kind of this confluence where from this point forward, life is gonna forever change, because in my mind, I'm making the decision that will set the course of my life. And here is a man who has been serving in the same profession, in the same community, as a physician, many of the same families, though now 3 generations of them. And he's asking the very same question. And on the one hand, it's deflating, but on the other hand, it takes all the pressure off. I find myself realizing that I now know that not knowing is just a part of life. And the passage that John Wayne just read for us, it introduces us to a transition from Elijah to Elijah. And throughout this story, you all have been reflecting on the faithfulness, first the faithfulness of God. That we see God's provision for the people of Israel, that God has restored this prophetic voice and ministry in Elijah in a way that is meaningful to the people of Israel. God is reopening communication as a demonstration of faithfulness to the people of Israel. But not only that, God is faithful to Elijah himself, that God is providing food from ravens when he is out in the wilderness. Coming to him as he hides out in a cave, the widow with this unending supply of oil who is able to provide for him. Over and again, we see God's faithfulness to Israel, to Elijah, but it is also a story of Elijah's faithfulness. As Elijah boldly lives into this call that God has given him. We see him stand up to the prophets of Baal. We see him speak truth to power in King Ahab. We see him faithfully living into this space. And now we come to the transition of Elijah, and we step into his story of faithfulness. And we find him at a moment of transition. And it strikes me that for each and every single one of us, we find ourselves over and over again in these seasons of transition. When I was 17, 18 years old, people asking me, what college? Are you going to go to college? What college are you going to go to? What major are you going to choose? What do you want to be when you grow up? You come out of college and what job should I take? In what company? In what profession? In what city should I change cities in order to change jobs, to have better opportunities in that same profession or maybe a different one at some future time? Who should I date? Who should I marry? Should I marry? Should we have children? Should we not have children? Should we adopt children? And the crazy thing is, we readily kind of see those big seasons of transition, but the reality is that even in the consistent flow of life, there's constant transition. Parenting a 6-month-old is a totally different job than parenting a 9-year-old, let alone how different it's going to be parenting an 18-year-old or a 27-year-old. Some of you find yourself in the place where I am, where my mom, being almost 40 years older than me, who has historically and still does parent me in a lot of ways, I am now stepping into some of those parental roles, coming alongside of her and living into this season of changes. She is still my mom, and yet I do some of the things for her that mom and dad once did for me. There are those of you in here who are stepping into or in that third of life, where you still have all of this life and vitality and skills and abilities, and you're asking yourself, what am I going to do with these independent of my vocational context in which I have always known them? Life is full of these transitions. And what I'd love to tell you that as we look at this text, Elijah is going to give a recipe for how we can make all of the right decisions in our life. We, of course, can't, and it won't. In fact, I'll even go as far as to say that in considering this transition, I'm not so much concerned with the right decisions as much as I am, are we living in such a way as to ensure that we are making good ones? In fact, the older I get, the less sure I am about right and wrong decisions when it comes to these moments of call, not in moral stuff. Some of you, your radar went up. I'm still very convicted of right and wrong morally. But which job should I take? I'm less concerned with that being a right or a wrong decision, so much as do we believe that we can live in such a way that our decisions and our actions reflect something of the character and nature of God and reveal that character and nature to others. So for those of you who are outline people, it's there in your bulletin. I'm going to consider 3 things. The first of which, every transition has a loss to mourn. Every transition has its footing to be found, and every transition has a calling to be heard. So first of those is every transition has a loss to mourn. When we look at Elijah's emergence in this story, it could be easy for us to try and put a purely positive spin on it. This is what he's been preparing himself for. And though Elijah is now gone, this is now Elijah's time. It's the changing of the guard in sports vernacular. This is next man, next woman up. But if we really allow ourselves to see what's happening in the text, we realize it's brutal. That his master of the last 6 to 18 years, his rabbi, his friend, his confidant, it's hard for us to get the chronology exactly how long Elijah has been mentoring Elijah, but it is as few as 6 and as many as 18 years that he has been his constant companion. And for those of us who were raised around Sunday school, we can kind of have an image of this text where there's like these white clouds and these beautiful horses, and Elijah with his kind of puffy white beard is zipping up into heaven. He's kind of looking back at Elijah and throws his cloak down to him to kind of pass his mantle of leadership. But that's not what this text says. This text says that there is this dark, malevolent tornado, this whirlwind comes down, and all of the fury of a storm And there is this chariot of fire and with it horses, and Elijah is pulled up from heaven, or pulled up in to heaven. He's not dead, but he disappears. And this is a traumatic scene. It's awesome, but it's a lot. And I love that Elijah has the maturity to mourn this loss. It says he cries out to God. He tears at his garments, which is an expression of grief. That too often I fear we can have this trite Christian impulse in sort of our Christian worldview to try and convince ourselves, and worse and more painfully others, that lemons and lemonade are the same thing. And I get why we do it. We trust in the redemptive power of Christ to do good, even in things that are hard or hurtful. But we sometimes have this impulse in our own lives and in the lives of others to say things like, when one door closes, another door opens. There are other fish in the sea, right? We say these things, knowing that there is some truth in them, but there is still loss, still pain, still sadness. And to feel these things isn't a lack of faith or fortitude. It's simply being human. The question becomes, how do we proceed in the midst of these losses? Even when the thing that we are giving up, we know it to be a good decision, it can still be something that we need to grieve as a loss. And I love that after grieving, the first thing that we see Elijah do is incredibly practical. That's often kind of where my mind goes with this stuff. That here is Elisha without his mentor, having to figure out what to do. And what does he do? He does exactly what he has seen. He takes this cloak of Elijah, puts it in the Jordan, it separates, and they go through. Well, if you were here last week, we read that that's how they got to the other side of the Jordan in the first place. Elijah took his own cloak, put it in the Jordan parted, and they walked through. Elijah now is trying to find himself in this new role. What does? He does what he's seen. And I think this incredibly practical wisdom. When we're in transition, when we're making decisions, are you asking, what have I seen faithful people do? And if you go, I don't know what I've seen them do, ask them. This is a rich community of faithful people. There are people here that you could ask. Tragically, I know that there are some of you who may be saying, to be honest, as a result either of my family story or my faith story, or even maybe I am just new to faith, and as a result, I don't have a rich community of faithful people on whom to draw. And I would say that there is actually a resource in that as well. One of the best parents I have ever known was our next door neighbor when we lived up here just a few blocks away at Licton Springs. She shared the townhouse wall with us, and she was a single mom, this amazing little gal. And I loved her parenting. That these two were thick as thieves. I mean, they were so tight, so close, and yet there was a structure and a sternness, and she managed to kind of do this dance between those two things beautifully, and partially because I'm entirely overwhelmed as the parent of a 6-month-old. I've got William in my arms, my son. Her daughter has kind of wandered off. We're having a barbecue at her house, and I say, Kim, how do you do it? How are you so good at this? And she kind of chuckles, and she says, to be honest, I've thought about that a lot. I just ask myself, what would my mom do? And I kind of knowingly begin to nod with her, and then she says, and then I do the polar opposite of that thing. And I like you, I kind of chuckled, and she says, I'm actually being completely serious. And she went on to tell a story of neglect, even to the point of abuse. And one of the greatest resources for her in parenting had been to take lessons of faithfulness from unfaithfulness. Often in these early seasons of transitions, as we deal with the change and the loss of what was, when there is an uncertainty to proceed, we must ask, how have faithful people proceeded? Or how would faithful people proceed? The second thing for us to consider, every transition has to find its footing. I love that in this story that Elijah comes through the Jordan to this company of prophets. Elijah was not only a mentor to Elijah, but he was a mentor to this school of prophets as well, that he was a rabbi to this larger community. And as Elisha emerges from the Jordan, this community of prophets come out to him, and either knowing what has happened or having seen what has happened, they say to Elijah, there's quite a few of us here, why don't we split up and go look for Elijah? And Elijah's like, I don't think that's the point of what happened. I don't think he's just misplaced. But they really persist. And he says, really, it's not worth it. And they go, but we could check like mountains, valleys. And I love that Elisha, in their persistence, is too ashamed not to send them. And of course, they go out, they look, they don't find anything. When they come back, he's mature enough to tell them, I told you so. But I love that the first decision that we see in his transition, his first step in leadership is one of insecurity, uncertainty, and weakness. And how common is that for us? And this is particularly meaningful when contrasted with the boldness that we have already seen from Elisha. In 1 Kings chapter 19, as Elijah calls Elisha, we see this story of almost unfettered boldness from the younger. Elijah comes to him, it's kind of weird. He takes the same cloak that he's dropped. He throws it over Elijah and he pulls him to him upon God's command to go and call this guy. And he says, you're now called into this ministry of prophets. And Elijah says to Elijah, hey, can I just go back and say goodbye to my family? And a great response from Elijah says, what have I done to you? In essence, he's saying, what does it have to do with me? It's God who called you. Ask God. I don't know if you can go back. Whether Elisha does ask or not, I don't know. He does go home. He goes back to his family to say goodbye. But not only that, but a picture has already been given to us of Elisha, that he is a person of considerable wealth. When Elijah found him, he is managing one of his 6 pairs of oxen as he plows his fields. So he not only has fields, he not only has 12 oxen, he has at least 5 people who work with him to manage these other to manage these other teams of oxen. But when Elijah goes back, he busts up the plows, he lights them on fire, he kills his oxen and serves a feast to his entire community. He is quite literally burning the ships. There is no going back for Elijah. His inheritance, his safety net, all of that has been sacrificed in order for him to live into the call. This is a bold character, but when we find him in this story, he's not standing there going, Coach, put me in. I'm ready to go. We realize that wanting the mantle of leadership and having the mantle of leadership are 2 very different things. And his first decision is a total bust. And again, that's not uncommon. But like Elijah, we must give ourselves, and often when we are standing outside of that transition or helping to facilitate it, we need to give others grace. It's hard to do. It is hard for us to muster grace when we fail. Oftentimes, for many of us, it's actually easier to extend grace to others than it is to ourselves. But here's the beauty. The grace that we need muster isn't really ours at all. Paul reminds us of this in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, as Paul is talking about a physical affliction, a thorn in his flesh. We're not exactly sure what that looks like, but it is this barrier for him to live into the calling that he has until the moment that God comes to him and says to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. My grace is sufficient for you. See, the key to faithfulness is not fortitude. The key to faithfulness, like Elijah and Elisha, is not simply bowing one's back and putting your shoulder to the plow, or even just being gracious to oneself. The key to faithfulness is dependence. God's gift to us isn't some ratty old cloak, right? Here's Elijah. That's the gift that he has given for leadership, this cloak that has been in the wilderness, been there as he set the altar on fire. It's soaking wet. He just used it to part the Jordan. Here is your gift. God's gift to us is the fullness of the indwelling Christ. Every ounce of God in Christ inhabiting our hearts. And so naturally, we're going to be unsure as we take next steps in this life. I don't know what job to take, what retirement holds. I don't know how to parent. I don't know what I'm going to do with my life. And in all of those things, Christ says to us, my grace is your grace. But when Christ is saying that, what he is actually saying is that all of the grace that has ever existed in all of cosmic history is immediately available to you, because all of that which is grace is embodied in Christ, and Christ inhabits our hearts. And we need simply to lean in to that gift, to receive that grace. Finally, every transition has a calling to be heard. And here, my fear always is that we can get kind of pulled back into this notion of the right and the wrong decisions. And I think it can be helpful, and so I'm just going to stop for a second and say, oftentimes when we talk about God's call, there's two different things that we're talking about. A specific call that is often really closely correlated to doing. And sometimes when we're talking about God's call, we're asking, is God calling me into this job or out of this job or into this place or out of that place? And it's really a calling of doing. It's a specific call. There is also a more general call, which is where we're going to spend the majority of our time kind of reflecting on this morning. And it is more the call of being. And I'm going to emphasize that one in part because I think it is transcendent and helpful to us in answering the doing, but also the call of doing is often better discerned individually. That you should be praying as you come to these places of what's next. You should be fasting. You should be coming to the biblical witness and seeing how faithful people have proceeded in life. You should be seeking wisdom from faithful people in your life. You should be assessing your skills and abilities, or better yet, accurately assessing your skills and abilities. And sometimes that requires the help of others to go, no, I'm not sure I'm seeing what you're seeing. But I'm emphasizing being here because lost in the story of Elijah's doing, potentially is the story of Elijah's becoming. And this work of becoming is so significant that despite the abruptness of Elijah's sort of emergence into ministry, Elijah is ripped away from him. He now steps into it, but we know that he has spent somewhere between 6 and 18 years being prepared for this moment. He has spent those years becoming. Elijah wasn't just teaching him prophecy and how to do that, but he was teaching him what it meant to be a prophet, what it meant to be a person of God, what it meant to be a follower of God. As I talked with my 9-year-old son about this passage, which I often do just because I love his reflections, and I explained Elijah, I just read him the passage, and he says, it sounds to me like Elisha is the Padawan and Elijah is the Jedi Master. And I'm not a big Star Wars guy, and so I'm like, yeah, but I think that's right? That throughout their time together, Elijah has been focused on who Elijah was becoming as a part of his own story of faithfulness. That he wasn't just a prophet of God, but he was a prophet of God who was also a mentor invested in the life of Elijah and in this company of other prophets as well. And at the same time, Elijah hasn't just been learning this one job, but he has been doing the hard and consistent work of becoming the person that God has created him to be. And these are questions that we need to be asking as we reflect on what's next. Who am I becoming, and how am I invested in the becoming of others? Who am I actively becoming, and how am I invested in the becoming of others? And that can seem like kind of an obtuse, sort of ethereal question, but I contend that it is not. Your legacy is not going to be measured on what you have built. Your legacy will not be measured by your 401k or by the bridge that you engineered or by the code that you wrote or the curriculum that you created. but rather our legacy is going to be measured by the fruit that we produce as it manifests in the lives of those around us. And if we truly believe that our role as followers of Christ are to both revel in and reveal something of the character and nature of God, and if we take Pastor Richard at his word, who says all of the time that revelation always leads to transformation, then we must acknowledge that we are in the business of forming. That we are in the business of investing ourselves in the becoming of others. This notion of becoming is 100% a marriage question. That for those of you who are younger, you might think that the marriage question is simply a question of with whom might I be the happiest? It's a neat question, and I hope the best for you, but it's not the promises that you're going to make. The promises that you're going to make in marriage is who will love me even when I am unlovely? And who am I committed to loving even in their unloveliness, in their sickness, in their health, in their wealth, in their poverty? That marriage is about who in this life is willing to be humble enough to help invest in me that I might more fully become who it is that God would have me to be. And how can I beat them at that? How can I submit myself to them in such a way that I can help them to become who it is that God has created them to be? This is 100% the work of parenting, the forming of human beings. I had a painful realization here in the last couple weeks where it dawned on me, I've been aware of it at various times, that I'm entirely too focused on the conforming of my kids than the forming of my kids. How are they behaving? How are you perceiving them? Better question for the 11 o'clock service when they be here, and it'll be relevant, right? How are you all perceiving that as my kids are used to just coming up and sitting on my lap at church? Barn church is a different context. But so much of my energy is spent in this notion of kind of making sure that my kids look and sound right. And then we have these moments, and for me, this moment a couple weeks ago, my son and I all summer long have been talking about taking a backpacking trip. And so we did 18 miles from Stehekin to Highway 20 on the Pacific Crest Trail. And he's been looking forward to this. I've told him throughout that this is gonna be a grown-ups trip. And grown-ups don't complain. You can see my motivation. But I was also saying it's just gonna be you and I. And so, you know, you're gonna cut your own summer sausage with your own pocket knife, you know? Like, this is grown-up stuff. And he really seized on that, asked me about it throughout the summer. My son, being my son on day 2, goes, "Hey, Dad, you know how you said you were gonna talk to me like a grown-up?" I said, "Yeah, buddy." He says, "Is Santa Claus real?" Well played, sir, right? But unbeknownst to us, the second day of our hike, we have to do 10 miles in order to get out. We do the first 6, we come to a junction, and there is a very confusing sign and a ribbon across a trail, not the trail that I need, that says the Pacific Crest Trail is closed due to fire. And I'm like, are they talking about this section of the trail or the next section of the trail? I'm not entirely sure. Fortunately, I have this GPS device where I can text my wife. So I'm like, hey, they're saying there's a fire. All of the fires are on this side. We had come from the other side. We had been paying close attention to fires. There weren't fires before that day. And so I text my wife, and she doesn't know about that fire yet either. And so she's like, cool, see you at 6. And I'm like, not really answering the question. And so we hike a mile, and we come up out of the valley floor. And as we get to this hill, I can now see this hillside that looks to be about 3 miles away. And I know I have 3 miles left, and that hill is very much smoking. And there's helicopters dropping water on it, and there's planes flying over and dropping water on it. So I text my wife again. I'm like, hey, road might be closed. Not sure what's going on. And I get another text back that's like, think you're good. Road's open. You know, I'm like, not helpful. And so we go another mile, and now we're not talking smoke. I can see trees on fire. The helicopter that we had been seeing throughout the day, miles away, is flying directly over our heads. And I send my wife a text that says, freaking out. Is this trail blocked by fire? My wife doesn't get a lot of texts from me that say freaking out. And so she gets it. She calls 911. She calls the Park Service. We start talking. The entire time, with each ridge we come over, I'm thinking, are we going to see flames in the woods? Am I doing the worst possible thing, marching my son to his death? And finally, as we get to mile 17, we have one left, I get this text from my wife that says, I'm here with the ranger, and he says, if you can get out quickly this last mile, then you don't need to turn around and go the 18 miles back. And totally unfairly, I look at my son, say, hey, brother, we've been talking like grown-ups. There's a bit of a dangerous situation we're in. I need to know if you have another gear. And he looks at me and he says, I got another gear, Dad. I said, do you need me to take your pack for you? He says, that would be unfair. I started this hike with my pack. I'm gonna finish this hike with my pack. And he didn't just mean it was gonna be unfair to me because I had to take his pack. He meant it was unfair to him. By God, this hike, I have a backpack and I'm gonna finish with it. Earlier in the day, he had shared with me, because I was just having him talk because I needed him to be distracted. And he was telling me about clone troopers and more Star Wars stuff that I don't understand. And he had at one point said that the clone troopers have been programmed in such a way that their mission is a singular focus on success. And in that last mile, he turns and looks at me and he goes, singular mission, or singular focus on success, Dad. So, excuse me. So we hike out of the woods. My wife is standing in the middle of Highway 20 crying. She's standing in the middle of a highway because it's closed, as this trail that I'm on is closed. I walk out into the parking lot. There's nobody in the parking lot except for all the firefighters who are waiting to go up into the hill. I have my head hung in shame because I'm that dad who's just hiked his kid through a forest fire. I get into the car. William immediately begins to talk about caterpillars and moths and a cold Fanta and how delicious it is. And I'm sitting in the front seat weeping like a baby. Emotional fatigue, shame, and overwhelmingly, this moment of realizing who my son is becoming. I got a glimpse of the person, the man in there, and the strength and fortitude and character and grit, and I am so grateful that it was just a glimpse. Several times on that trail, as it widened out, he would drop back and hold my hand. And I just go, man, these days are fleeting. So stay 9. I described it a little bit like a train going by, and I glimpsed through the window of this moving train, not only a man, but a man I want to become. Man I want to spend time with. And I was overwhelmed with gratitude for the people in my son's life who were invested in forming him. The other parents in our community, his Sunday school teachers, his teachers, who understand that this is the legacy of our life and investing in who it is that people are becoming. So I'll close just simply saying, it's natural that as we come to these places of transition in our lives, we ask the question, am I making the right decision as a parent? I didn't. Am I making the right decision as a son or a husband, as a wife, as a friend, as a teacher, as a classmate, as a pastor? Am I making the right decision as an employer? Are you? I honestly don't know. It's hard to know in the moment. But to the degree that we can say the decisions that we're making reflect something of the nature and character of God to those around us, we needn't be so concerned with whether they are right, but to trust that they are good. And God, who is gracious, will make power in our weakness. Amen? Amen.